stood up to do this, but I'm so short-sighted I can't actually read my point 10 text unless I sit down and stare at it, so you'll have to forgive me that. Thanks to Francis for that very, very kind introduction. Just to give you a little bit more about me, I'm basically a literary critic, but my kind of astrology is done in a very CPA, psychological astrology style, so this is in that vein. I'm just going to be making some kind of discussions and suggestions about the astrology of the dwarf planet Eris from a mythological and psychological point of view. So these are really suggestions for you to think about. I'm not going to give anything along the lines of a kind of an Eris cookbook. So I want to begin with a quotation from Jean Rhys, just to consolidate some of the issues of violence, envy, hatred, and so on that this material brings up. And it's from her novel Good Morning Midnight, about descent into madness and alcoholism. And it goes, "Never mind. One day, quite suddenly, when you're not expecting it, I'll take a hammer from the folds of my dark cloak and crack on your little skull like an eggshell. Crack it will go, the eggshell. Out they will stream the blood, the brains. One day, the fierce wolf that walks by my side will spring on you and rip your abominable guts out. One day. So that's a kind of iridian energy that we're going to be dealing with. So, as we all know, one of the excitements that comes along maybe once or twice in a modern astrologer's life is the discovery of a major new planet. So we had it in 1930 with Pluto, and then again in 1977 when Chiron came to light. So both of these have proved to be obviously enormously important in the birth chart, but it takes, as we all know, astrologers some time to be able to work out the archetypal symbolism with which a new planet is freighted. So I'm aware that I'm sticking my neck out by discussing a planetoid that's relatively new. So anyway, we have a new planet, or dwarf planet, to consider, which is Eris, one of a number of so-called Kuiper belt objects, and it's larger than Pluto and 3 times further out. And I'll say at this point that my instinct is that this one is going to turn out to be very important. So, as we know, not only is the time in which a new planetoid comes to light very important, but also the naming can be essential. So, as planetary principles kind of nudge up into consciousness, they appear at kind of the same time as the planets are discovered. So the giving of names is a very kind of archetypal process, and the names fit the planets in a mysterious way. So people have continued to feel that there's something mysterious and dignified about the heavens, deserving of names with mythic resonances, which is why, of course, we all call Uranus, and not William Herschel's ghastly original suggestion, which was Georgium Sidus, George III star. The French didn't like that very much. So the giving of Greco-Roman names keys us in to Greco-Roman mythology, which is another related source of insight about the nature of a new heavenly body. So I'm going to be talking about both of these today. And the intricate patterns of myth, of course, represent another human attempt at capturing the total richness and complexity of the psyche. So, Eris. Eris was discovered in 2005, and it's a little smaller than our moon, and a quarter as big, again, as Pluto, and it's got one satellite of its own. It has a highly eccentric orbit, which takes it 3 times farther out than Neptune or Pluto, as noted above, but also brings it close to the latitude at various points in its 577-year orbital cycle. So this is very, very, very slow. And like Pluto, it's oddly angled against the plane of the solar system. Most of the planets are like that, as we know, but Pluto and Eris are up at one angle. When it was first discovered, it was given an alphanumeric designation, and then the working name Xena, after Lucy Lawless's character in the TV series. I don't know if any of you have seen Xena, Princess Warrior, but if your idea of fun is going around in an armoured bra, then kind of that's what you need, really. So this is an interesting example of the way that an archetypal complex of images was already being generated. So the planet was identified as feminine, Xena, and also as the strange one, the foreign one, which is what Xena means in Greek. And then the associations of the name of the actress, Lucy Lawless, were also extremely vivid and kind of synchronistic. The body also caused considerable chaos for astronomers. The discovery of a planetoid larger than Pluto called Pluto's status as a planet into question, and it took some months before the International Astronomical Union could resolve the issue and make the system watertight. So until this was done, the planet couldn't be officially named because there are different criteria for how you name planets depending on how big the class of object that they are. So when an agreement was reached, Pluto was downgraded to the status, as we know, of a dwarf planet, along with Xena and the largest of the asteroids, Ceres, and eventually the name Eris, after the Greek goddess of strife, was given to the new heavenly body. So we all, as astrologers, observe Riley as the planet was so dubbed, reflecting on chaos and discord that had been produced, set in motion, and yet again a new planet seemed to have an apt name. Eris's moon, incidentally, is called Dysnomia, which means lawlessness in Greek, so it's a little homage to Lucy Lawless there. I meant to have a PowerPoint with a picture of her in her armoured bra. So, what might the new planet mean astrologically? Well, first things first. Like other new planets, Eris should represent a collective rather than a personal principle, because everyone born over a 50-year period will have Eris in the same sign. So, in fact, because of its peculiar, very elliptical orbit, Eris goes through some signs much more quickly than others, as in much the same way that Chiron does. So, one of the disadvantages of this is that the consultant astrologer is therefore likely to meet only people who have Eris in Aries. Or if the client happens to be in their 70s and 80s, I don't know, I've never had anyone come to me for a reading who's in their 80s, but I suppose it must happen. Then you might meet someone with it in Pisces. This means it's impossible to get a direct experience of how Eris functions in, say, Libra, although in 300 years we will no doubt find out. We've got a less extreme version of this problem with Pluto, because there's no one alive with Pluto in Taurus, but the astrologer might just meet people with Pluto in Cancer, Leo, and so on, Virgo, Libra. So this allows us to get a sense of how the planet functions, at least in different elements in the case of Pluto, but that's much more difficult with Eris. So, except by means of historical inquiry, we're not going to be able to get much sense of how Eris is like as a generational influence in air or earth. So the blindfold's on, and we're really in the realm of the informed guess. But like other outer planets, Eris won't be a personal planet. The building blocks of the conscious ego, as we know in astrological terms, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn. We may well be implicated in the collective concerns of the generation we're part of through links between the personal planets and the outer ones, as everyone is. But these influences are wider than the merely personal ego and often difficult to integrate. So these planets tend to be, to use Liz Green's metaphor, tend to be indigestible to the ego, and I suspect that Eris will prove to be among the more difficult of these. So the conflicts and crises associated with Eris by house and aspect will be beyond the control of the individual, stretching us and confronting us with elements that are, as it were, alien to and beyond the individual personality. So the next and indeed fundamental key to working out the meaning of a new planet follows on from its name. And as I noted above, astrologers always look to the myth of the deity associated with the planet in question for insights into its meaning. And this only works sometimes, having proved less than helpful in the case of Uranus, Neptune and Pluto. The mythology of Neptune in particular is of only the vaguest use in understanding its action within the psyche. Now, this suggests to me that the archetypal meaning of new planets, representing principles that are kind of bubbling up into consciousness at the time of discovery, represent things that are hard for individuals to grasp. So, it's better names for Uranus, Neptune and Pluto, for example, would have been Prometheus, Dionysus and Moira. So these we should expect Eris to be difficult to get hold of. Eris is, fortunately, fairly distinct in mythological terms, and fascinatingly, and this is a crucial point, presents us with a dual face. Now, the Greek archaic poet Hesiod describes in his poem The Works and Days how there are two types of Eris. So this is, as it were, this is the foundational quote for thinking about how Eris functions in mythology. And Hesiod says, "After all, there was not only one variety of Eris, of strife, but over earth two strifes exist. One type men would praise when they see her at work, but the other they revile, for they have wholly different natures. This one, a cruel being, foments evil and war and battle. No mortal loves her, but under compulsion by the will of the deathless gods, they pay harsh strife her due of honour. But the other is the elder daughter whom dark night brought forth, and the son of Kronos on high, dwelling in the upper air, embedded her in earth's roots. She is much kinder to men. She stirs up even the idle to hard work. For a man grows eager to labour when he sees his neighbour, a rich man who hurries to plant and plough and put his house in order, and one neighbour contends with another as they hurry after wealth. This life is good for men. Potter, too, is piqued with potter, craftsman with craftsman, beggar begrudges beggar, and bard resents bard. Now this is very, very important, this quotation. All the planets are double-faced and multivalent. They have positive and negative manifestations in human terms. But the mythology of Eris makes this absolutely explicit from the start. The doctrine of the two Erises in the Works and Days is a kind of rewriting of the description of the bad Eris in Hesiod's own earlier poem, the Theogony. She appears there as the sister of the god of war, the sister of Ares, causing bloodshed and giving birth to a catalogue of miseries. And Hesiod says, abhorred Eris brought forth painful toil, forgetfulness and famine, tearful sorrows and squabbles too, battles, murders, manslaughters, quarrels, lies, disputes, lawlessness, keyword, and ruin, all of a similar nature, and also oath, who troubles men upon earth when anyone wilfully swears a false oath. So, Ares' unpleasant sister is elsewhere called Enyo. In the Iliad, Homer identifies Eris and Enyo. So the mythological picture so far is giving us a negative Eris, embodied in argument and conflict, but also the positive Eris, who represents the urge to achieve, the urge to strive, the spur of healthy competition. So I find it very interesting that Eris was discovered at just the moment that we have kind of arguments in our educational system about how people relate to each other and how important competition is between school students, and whether competition is a healthy thing or whether it's destructive to kind of forming personalities. So there's kind of Iridian themes which are at work. So mythologically speaking, Eris seems to represent strife and striving. That's a distinction that I'd like to draw quite strongly. Contention, as well as a rather Thatcherite-sounding competition. However, it's very striking that Hesiod's attempt to demarcate between these two Erises as having wholly different natures wobbles towards the end of that passage that I read out to you. He says they're completely different, and then at the end of describing the good Eris, he says, Potter is piqued with potter, craftsman with craftsman, beggar begrudges beggar, and bard resents bard. So in fact those two types of Eris are collapsing. The strife Eris and the striving Eris kind of fall together at the end. The vision of angry potters and resentment-filled beggars is taking the idea of rivalry, positive Eris, and moving it towards quarrelling and violence, negative Eris. So the thing they seem to share, the archetypal core, if you like, is envy. And as Liz Green has pointed out in the discussion of Saturnian defences, envy can be very, very creative. Through making envy conscious, you can discover what you want, and more importantly, what you value. Because you see it in someone else and you wish you had it. So envy, when you recognise it and channel it, can spur you on to develop the kinds of qualities and abilities which you might not otherwise have recognised as belonging to yourself. So if you can acknowledge envy, it can lead you. But if you can't acknowledge envy, it can lead you to attempt to destroy the person or the institution which possesses the quality that you don't feel you have yourself. So the positive Eris is actually called, in some places, emulation elsewhere in the literature. And I think the concept of conscious and unconscious envy might well be the key to the astrological Eris. So I'll come back. I want to talk more about the psychodynamics of envy in a moment. But of course, the most famous mythological story concerning Eris is her role as catalyst of the Trojan War. Now, the goddesses Hera, Athene, and Aphrodite had been invited, along with the rest of the population of Olympus, to the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, the mother and father of Achilles. But Eris had been snubbed because of her troublemaking inclinations. So, the bad fairy in the folktale Briar Rose and the wonderfully creepy Maleficent in Disney's Sleeping Beauty are kind of clear sub-literary echoes of Eris. So Eris therefore tosses into the party the apple of discord, a golden apple inscribed to the fairest, provoking the goddesses to begin quarrelling about the appropriate recipient. So the hapless Paris, as we all know, because we know the story, was appointed to select the most beautiful of the three goddesses by Zeus, a mythic complex which Liz Green has seen as very relevant to the crises and challenges experienced by Librans. So each of the three goddesses attempts to bribe Paris to choose her. Hera offers political power, Athena skill in battle, and Aphrodite tempts him with the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, wife of Menelaus of Sparta, which Paris haplessly chooses, and which brings about the utter destruction of Troy. So it should be apparent by now, I hope, that Eris is a powerful deity in myth, with an archetypally rich series of themes with which we can work as astrologers. So what I want to do now is turn a little bit more to discussing how kind of envy functions. So Eris, the very word, means conflict, strife, discord, or my favourite is havoc. And it represents, I think, and this is advanced tentatively, primal anger and frustration that we are not omnipotent, and that we are not intrinsically self-sufficient. So it's our own, or one way of reading it might be to take it as our own unconscious hatred of our unavoidable weakness as human beings, our dependence, and the consequences of that feeling in envy, competition, and destructiveness. So it's part of a human condition rooted in our very biology that our wills aren't directly active upon the world, that we want something and we can't make it happen, we can't influence the world in a kind of direct way, and that we're constantly thwarted in the exercise of our desire. So that there's a gap between wanting and getting. It's a kind of, it's just part of human life. So when we come into the world, the source of food, comfort, love is outside ourselves in mother's body, and throughout our lives we continue to hunger and thirst, to age, to go to sleep, and eventually we must die. So I think one of the most deep kind of emotional consequences of this unconscious drive is envy, which, as I said, in my opinion, is the chief keyword of the Astrological Eris. There's, of course, the Venusian envy, with which we're all reasonably familiar, but ultimately I think Eris represents a deeper and more archaic archetype. So, to borrow a term from the child psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, Eris is the astrological symbol of primal envy. Now, Klein is one of those people who people who are not interested in psychoanalysis find very, very off-putting, because it's very much the case that those of us who are astrologers tend to be interested in Jung, tend to turn to Freud, but Klein sees the development of the psyche as a kind of gothic psychodrama. So it's full of very alarming things like ascribing to infants the urge to claw at mother's breast, to fill the breast with feces, that kind of thing. It's very, very dark, sinister vision of the nature of the psyche. But Klein has this very important concept, primal envy. It means an innate destructiveness arising from the psyche very early in infancy, which arises from a deep ambivalence towards the fact that we are dependent, that we're dependent on our mother, which, and mother, by the blunt fact of her very existence, denies our solipsistic fantasies of unlimited potency and self-sufficiency. So we feel gratitude, certainly, when we are fed, when we're breastfed, but this gratitude is mixed with unconscious hostility and brings it with the urge to turn away from the source because we are not it, because we are differentiated from it. So this ambivalence, this mixture of gratitude and envy and destructiveness, is the root of primal envy. Now, envy, in psychoanalytic terms, is very, very disputed. One of the major debates is to whether envy is something that is inbuilt into the human psyche, an inbuilt drive, or whether it's something that comes about to do with kind of childhood rearing, or kind of early infancy. And Klein, who I'm going with at the moment, thought that envy is kind of hardwired into us. It's part of our software, if you like. These kind of complex and controversial theories about how envy is formed, I want to put for one side, and I want to just turn briefly to a literary figure, and that's Satan in Milton's great epic poem Paradise Lost, just to give us some feeling of how this primal feeling of hostility towards the good works. Satan rebels from God, the creator and source of all existence, including his own, wanting to believe instead, this is very Iridian, that he and his followers are self-begot, self-raised by their own quickening power. In the world of Milton's poem, this is a self-delusion disguised under grand and staring rhetoric. Satan envies God's self-sufficiency. The faithful angels can worship and admire God's goodness, but Satan wants to have it and for God not to have it. So this is a very, very key idea. So this kind of envy is a complex and unsettling emotion. It's linked with both resentment and pride, and it's often confused with jealousy. Envy is a very interesting emotion to think about because it's one emotion that people find it very shameful to admit to. It's very interesting. They often feel that it's kind of beyond the pale. People could admit to being jealous, but to admit to envy there's something uniquely shameful about it. It's very, very interesting to think about Eris in those terms. However, envy and jealousy are in fact kind of distinct. And at this point, I just want to kind of try and define envy more precisely. At its most basic, envy is the longing to possess something that other people have. So it's commonly, but not always, seen as involving the desire that the other person who has the thing you want will not have it. So there's a famous quotation from Gore Vidal which says, "It's not enough to succeed, others must fail." And that's a very, very good kind of definition of how envy works. It involves the desire that the person envied be deprived of the thing that they possess that the envier desires. So the thing which you desire is the envier, maybe a one-off, which is possessed only by one person at a time, such as a person's unique history or an ability like being the fastest 100-metre runner in the world. Or it may be something replicable, like a particular type of car. So if you have a Porsche and I envy you your Porsche, it might not be enough to assuage my envy that I should have one of my own. You have to crash yours and write it off. So full satisfaction of my invidious impulses would depend on you not having your Porsche and me having one. So the distinction is sometimes therefore made between benign envy, which wants to have the same as someone else has and doesn't require that they be deprived of what they have, and invidious envy, which is one of those spectacularly useless psychoanalytical phrases, which requires the envier to be the sole possessor of the thing envied, to the exclusion of others. Now, it's been disputed whether benign envy actually exists at all and doesn't deserve to be called something like aspiration or healthy competition. But in fact, the distinction between the two types of envy, as we've seen, you can see where this is going now, is very, very old and goes straight back to Hesiod's description of how the two Erises function. So the two faces of Eris, benign envy and invidious envy, might be one way to think about it. So envy, therefore, always involves two people, the envier and the envied. The envied possesses the good, which is the thing that the envier wants for him or herself. And here, this is where we come to the distinction which I want to make between envy and jealousy. Jealousy involves three people. The jealous person, the beloved or the love object, and the rival. When someone feels jealousy, the force, the kind of focus of their emotion is the love object, who is craved with possessive love. The jealous person's main feeling towards their rival is the urge to have them off the scene, to get them away from the love object who will then transfer his or her affections to the rival. The rival is essentially interchangeable. It doesn't matter who it is. Their personal qualities are not the focus of the jealous person. In envy, on the other hand, as we've seen, there are two people involved, not three. The envier and the rival. The thing envied, I've referred to as the good. It might be someone else's affections, but there's actually a rather kind of different thing. When we feel envy, our chief concern, the central kind of axis of the emotion, is to measure ourselves against our rival. The good in question is, in a sense, contingent. It's secondary to our attempt to soothe our self-esteem and to assuage inner feelings of inadequacy and self-reproach. For example, you might envy a rival. You might envy them their house, their children, their partner, their looks or their skills, but the object of envy is not your primary focus, however much the envious person may ache for it. The focus is your rival, the person who has that goodness or that validity that the envier feels they lack and that they desperately want for themselves. So this is a rivalrous contest, and envy is about two people, jealousy is about three. So envy arises from this sense, often unconscious, of powerlessness and inadequacy. It's a consequence of a very kind of human tendency to evaluate our well-being by comparing ourselves with other people, assessing how well we're doing by comparing ourselves with others. So we find it, I think this is probably true, we find it very difficult as human beings to get a sense of our own worth, to get a sense of our own value, and of what we're worth realistically. And instead, our frustration with our own helplessness, which we've all had as infants, we learn to gauge ourselves against other people. So if we unconsciously feel that they're of greater worth than ourselves, we feel ourselves weighed in the balance and found wanting. And we feel envy. And like any daimon, envy can be both creative and destructive, which brings us back to its benign and invidious forms. So envy can act as a powerful spur for competition in the attainment of excellence. So there are many high-achieving people are motivated by powerful, nagging senses of constantly falling behind their rivals and failing to live up to some obscure outer standard. I had a very, very nice, gentle, charming colleague at work who wouldn't say boo to a goose. And I once asked him how he manages to write so much, and he said, "I can never write unless I have someone to write against." And that's a good kind of illustration of the principle. And this kind of standard is in fact usually a kind of inner one, which operates unconsciously, taking the form of a restless self-dissatisfaction and a voracious hunger to achieve, and thus to assuage these painful feelings of inadequacy and impotence. So by emulating those whom we envy, we restore our sense of competence and potency. So we get locked into a pattern of keeping up with the Joneses, in which conspicuous kind of acquisition of consumer goods is a mask for an unconscious sense of punishing inadequacy. So it's as though one can never be assured that one is fundamentally all right, and so needs constant self-reassurance of worldly success or material objects displayed to their neighbours. So you can get caught on this kind of treadmill of envying and assuaging envy. So key words that we've had: rivalry, competition, potency. As astrologers, we're all instantly and quite correctly associate these with one planet, which is, of course, Mars. And indeed, in myth, Eris is sometimes, as we've seen, described as the sister and companion of Ares, the Greek deity identified with the Roman Mars. So we recall from what I was saying earlier that the archetypal significance of a newly discovered planet is often shadowed, is adumbrated by some qualities ascribed to a known one, which is merely another way of saying that some pairs of planets can make partial common cause, that they are, if you like, friends. So despite this kinship between Eris and Mars, Eris is not merely a kind of distant female Mars. Mars is a personal planet whose function has been described very aptly as being the strong man of the sun. That's a symbol of the drive and determination available for the pursuit of the ego's goals and for self-defense. But Eris is an outer planet, and therefore, by definition, transpersonal and collective. Its vastly slow and stately progress around the edge of the solar system represents a force that's not at the service of the personal ego. I think this is a very, very important kind of take-home point here. So we must ask ourselves what kind of iridian competition might be. As the myth tells us, it has something in it which is reminiscent of Mars, but which is deeper and less digestible to consciousness. My own feeling is that iridian competition could be seen in the slow kind of churn and thrash of Darwinian struggle, in that kind of dynamo of biological evolution, the survival of the fittest. The survival of the fittest is an incredibly iridian phrase. Astrologers have seen Pluto as a symbol of the kind of ruthless survivalism that's native to organic life, the urge to continue and transform that which is which any individual species is irrelevant to. So Pluto thus has a strong connection with the phenomenon of extinction in the service of the broader sweep of organic life. So if Pluto is the collective survival instinct at its most primitive, then Eris, I think, on one level, symbolises the competition between species for light, food, water, that drives natural selection. So I'm trying to argue that Eris, because it's further out than Pluto, is, as it were, kind of deeper, even more primitive and archaic biological drive. So members of a single species may differ significantly, and those which have some advantageous genetic quirk will survive and procreate in greater numbers. But then members of the same species which don't possess that advantage, so that the new adaptation passes through the gene pool. It seems rather iridian that genetic change is merely happenstance, an accident of kind of DNA replication. For every advantageous error in replication, there are innumerable useless or actively harmful changes. So this is individual, but not personal, which is a subtle difference, subtle but important difference. So if you want a kind of iridian key phrase to take away, the selfish gene is actually quite a good one if you look at Richard Dawkins' splendidly iridian phrase. So the paradox of the selfish gene actually sums up Eris quite well. Selfishness points to an individual will, but the self-replicating gene is actually the faceless, ancient and impersonal cornerstone of biological life. So one of the things that I'm writing a big book about Eris at the moment, is that if you look at various important dates to do with the publication of the origin of species, there are very significant Iridian themes running through Darwin's work, and then through the kind of neo-Darwinism as well, Dawkins and so on. So it's quite interesting, in fact, that Dawkins' hugely influential The God Delusion was published a year after Eris was first sighted. And at the anniversary of Darwin. Do? Yeah, do. I don't think he'd take very well to it. No. He's a prickly bastard. I sat next to him on a plane once. He sat there the whole way going, like that. I thought there was something very peculiar about him, actually. Anyway, sorry, that was by the bypass. So, God Delusion published a year after Eris was first sighted by astronomers, and then actually the anniversary of Darwin followed 2 years afterwards. So, Darwinian, evolutionary neo-Darwinian material is quite significant. So, Eris in myth, going back to myth Roman, is an ambiguous figure on several levels. The distinctive quality of Iridian struggle, individual but not personal, is suggested by her double parentage. So some Greek sources describe Eris as the uterine sister of Ares, the child of Hera, whether her father is Zeus is not clear. In others, she's one of the many daughters of Nyx, the goddess of night, and that's one of the in Greek they're called protogonoi, the shadowy firstborn generation of elemental beings older even than the Titans. So by that measure, Eris is a sister of some of the more mysterious and sinister figures of Greek myth. So these vary from very grand and implacable personifications like Nemesis, sleep, death, to unpleasant female spirits like the Erinyes, the avengers of blood rites with their torches, snaky hair and eyes that ooze pus. The Moirai, the triple personifications of fate, and other bogies like Lyssa, which means derangement, and Ate, which means frenzy. So Eris's conflict or discord is thus built into the fabric of the Greek view of the universe, and by extension, the Greek view of the psyche. So it's one of those very striking things which, as astrologers, I'm sure we've all noticed, that Greek personifications are rarely male. The Greeks certainly had male underworld spirits, but unavoidable facets of the human condition are normally feminine to the Greeks. So female monstrosity or female facelessness is the normal Greek metaphor for what we would call the most primitive and archaic layers of the psyche. For our sense of boundaries that must not be overstepped, or natural law, the claims of blood kinship that go deeper than sophisticated rational ethics, and the terrifying, invasive powers of guilt or insanity. So these are really dark, primitive, archaic forces that we're dealing with, and Eris is one of them. So Eris, with her dual descent, lies somewhere between being a kind of minor Olympian, albeit an unwelcome one, that's when she's daughter of Hera, and being one of the primal spirits of earth and blood and darkness, who belong to a much more ancient and impersonal order of things. So again, this Iridian theme of there being two kind of superimposed images. So this duality is an Iridian theme which we're going to come across again and again. Eris's competition, rivalry, envy, not only requires two parties, but is herself mysteriously twofold, mysteriously dual. So whenever we come to interpret Eris astrologically, and I hope that maybe some of you after this will think about just having a look at Eris when you do charts, we must ask ourselves, are we dealing in this particular chart with the sister of Mars or with the daughter of primal night? Which are the two versions of Eris are we dealing with? So, going back to envy, Hesiod's positive Eris seems to me to have an obvious bearing on economic issues, and I just want to touch on some of these things, and then against what I said, I'm going to give you a little cookbook. In Greek, the word for the well-ordered house of the industrious peasant, the kind of industrious peasant, is the same that lies behind our word for economics, the rules of housekeeping, that's what economics means, or something along those lines. So this is worth a little degree, I think, of speculation. On the one hand, the principle of Eris is emulation. So, just to remind you, you experience Eris as emulation when you see someone who has something that you want, and you think, I'm going to work harder until I can afford it. brings to mind kind of Keith Joseph and Thatcherite economic policy. This is, if you think about that famous brickbat against Thatcherism, it's the politics of envy. By Thatcherists against socialists. The desire for self-betterment is inculcated by the urge to enjoy for oneself what others have, thus driving growth and ensuring efficiency within a deregulated market. So Eris, I think, is a very key factor at work within certain kinds of economic theory. But these phenomena, as we all know, always form an archetypal union with their opposites. So I'm inclined to see the Thatcher government stroke old left conflicts of the early 1980s as profoundly suggestive of the nature of the astrological Eris. So whilst the left saw Thatcher's free market economics as heartless, elevating competition against, above all other human concerns and initiating a decade of grotesque conspicuous consumption, the right saw only sour resentment which discouraged ambition and entrepreneurship. So this is an archetypal conflict, where the left sees greed, the right sees envy, and it's necessary to justify, they need each other to justify their self-righteousness. So Hesiod's picture of the relationship between the two men, one shiftless and one industrious, is recalled. So it's very interesting to look at, for example, the chart of Arthur Scargill and the chart of Margaret Thatcher, and the relative positions of Eris within them. It's very, very interesting. They're both terribly, strongly Iridian people. So whatever one thinks of Maggie, her emphasis on the importance of competition, not only in the goods market, but also in capital and labour markets, closely echoes the mythology of Eris. It should come as no surprise to find, therefore, that her birth chart features a strong Venus-Eris trine. We should remember that the word Venus, of course, is related to the etymological word for buying and selling. And in any case, it comes from an Indo-European root, wen, which means to strive after. So again, striving, this very key Iridian idea. It's Venus Aphrodite, after all, who ends up in myth with Eris's apple. There's a connection between the two. In Thatcher's chart, Eris forms an inconjunct aspect of the moon, and is also just conjunct Uranus out of sign, suggesting the nasty, kind of disruptive shock that policies gave the UK, as well as the cruel way in which she imposed economic provision for what she saw as the country's own good. I'm trying very hard to be politically non-partisan. You can take a small guess at the end. So, as she came to power, transiting Eris squared her natal Jupiter and Pluto exactly, and inconjuncted Saturn. So, indeed, Thatcher conducted her entire premiership under a close Jupiter-Pluto-Eris T-square, suggesting a kind of radical, brutal transformation, Pluto, of the country's institutions of wealth creation to foster unchecked growth, Jupiter, by means of competition and economic aspiration, Eris. So, in the early 1980s, transiting Pluto opposed Eris. Just as the minor strike got going, it squared Jupiter. So it's a nice example of the way that political events mysteriously find protagonists who map onto the astrological weather. So Thatcher even unknowingly echoed Hesiod, famously claiming to be an ordinary, thrifty housewife. So that's straight out of Hesiod's description of Eris. And as always, it takes two people to express both sides of a kind of archetypal conflict, into which there's this mysterious unity. So I was very unsurprised to find out that Arthur Scargill, who, as we know, is leader of the National Union of Mine Workers and Thatcher's chief opponent during the miners' strike in 84-85, has Eris closely conjunct Saturn. So he's a very Iridian figure. As Thatcher left power in 1990, Eris was beginning to oppose her natal sun. Furthermore, and no, I haven't got time to go into it here, Thatcher's single-minded and, in fact, immensely popular at the time pursuit of the Falklands War, in particular the sinking of the Belgrano, suggested the archetype of the other Eris, the sister of Aries, was not absent from her nature. So if you want a really good Iridian picture, that awful picture of Maggie sitting in a tank in a white headscarf is actually quite a vivid one. So one final strategy we can use to get a sense of how Eris might work psychologically is to consider how well it might get on with the other planets. So you can do this using a kind of mixture of astrological experience, mythology, and intuition. So really I'm going to pull together all the themes that I've talked about today by going briskly through the planets. So some astrological principles have a certain amount of common ground. You know, Mercury and Uranus are friends, if you like, and the Moon and Neptune, or Saturn and Chiron, or the Sun and Mars, can, as it were, make a partial common cause. So let me just have a swig of water. Some pairings are less happy. The Sun, a symbol of the personal consciousness, is swamped and threatened by Neptune's kind of amorphous ego obliteration, and the Moon's penchant for identifying with the body and with one's roots makes it an uncomfortable, when you put it next to Uranus's cool, dissociative disregard of the flesh. Now, Eris's collective nature is unlikely to make it a natural bedfellow for the Sun. If, as I suspect, Eris reflects a very primitive level of struggle in organic life, then it stands in marked contrast to the Sun's personal values. If, on the other hand, the urge to strive, the urge to distinguish oneself from the common herd is germane to the Sun, it's a very kind of solar theme. So I wonder if there's something Iridian in this idea of injured merit, because Eris is pissed off that she doesn't get invited to Peleus and Thetis' wedding. That's why she's angry. So I wonder if there's something solar Iridian in this idea of injured merit and associated concomitants of kind of insecurity and inflation. So I'm going to come on in a moment to speak about Iago in Shakespeare's Othello in these terms. So it's fitting somehow that, going back to Sleeping Beauty, that Maleficent, the bad fairy, should be so aristocratic. If you watch it, she's posh, and the other fairies are kind of bourgeois. It's very kind of interesting. So the kind of good fairies are all kind of cooperative and busy, whereas Maleficent is on her own, and she's a kind of grande dame. So Sun Eris might therefore suggest contempt for and hatred of the collective as the kind of common herd, a terrible sense of insecurity and resentment at exclusion, disguised by inflation and the tendency to autocracy. So what I'd be very, very interested in is if anyone looks at charts they know well in these terms to find out whether these things are helpful, these insights actually work for you. I'd be most interested in feedback. I'd add also that Eris and the Moon have much common ground. The Moon symbolises what makes us comfortable, and Eris is likely to be a very, very uncomfortable energy indeed. That said, a fiery Moon, Eris conjunct Moon in Aries, which a lot of us will have, relishes challenge, and competition might be, it might be able to express this energy in a healthy way. A Cancerian Moon squaring Eris might be rather more difficult. Mercury is a different matter. Behind the astrological Mercury is the archetype of the trickster, wonderfully explored in, if you don't know it, in a brilliant book by Lewis Hyde called Trickster Makes This World. And he describes the trickster in that book as creative intelligence in the service of appetite. It's a really brilliant phrase. So the trickster is a figure in mythology who is curious, ambiguous, given to devilment, and Mercury, as a kind of thief and mischief maker, has something in common with the mythological Eris. Both can foster conflict. I'm very much reminded of a West African myth, the Yoruba myth, in which Eshu, the messenger of the gods, who kind of corresponds in some ways to Mercury, Hermes, he walks a line between two men who are working in fields on either side of a road. So he's walking along the road, and two men on either side. And one man thinks the god Eshu is wearing a red hat, and one man thinks the god Eshu is wearing a black hat. And they fall to arguing, and eventually they kill each other. And as Eshu walks on, he turns around and reveals that one side of the hat is red, and one side of the hat is black. So mercurial conflict arises from the archetype's sheer kind of ambivalence, and can be prevented by the intelligent fostering of multiple perspectives. So negative Eris foments disaffection and disputes out of a sense of personal slight, creating conflict by revealing tensions that are present but unconscious. This is an idea which I haven't had time to talk about, but Eris is a revealer of latent tension in the psyche. I think is quite an important theme. So the inscribed apple, which Eris kind of lobs into the god's wedding party, is after all designed to prey on the vanity of the three goddesses and to set them at each other's throats. With Venus, myth gives us a hint, and it's Venus, as I've noticed, who ultimately benefits from the choice of Paris. I've also mentioned positive Eris's connection with imitative desire. That is the way we learn to want what we want because we see other people wanting it. So we don't want iPhones and Xboxes and so on until we see other people who have them and we desire. So this is all rather inimical to Venus's personal values, but there's common ground here with the Taurian side of Venus, with its kind of acquisitive connection to money and possession. So keeping up with the Joneses might be a kind of Venus-Eris phenomenon in archetypal terms. And given the competitive, invidious nature of positive Eris, we might think in connection with Venus the phrase "all's fair in love and war." That's not worth thinking about. Mars also plays an important role in the mythology of Eris, which suggests how they might interact astrologically. Eris is quite simply his sister, a kind of female version of unpleasant, brutal Ares, the most disliked of all the gods in Homer. One of the kind of interesting experiences you have if you read the Iliad is that Ares is not liked. Ares is a monster in Homer. He's not kind of warrior Mars who has a connection to farming as he is in Roman mythology. He's a bloodthirsty, kind of 300-foot tall creature. In the fourth book of the Iliad, Homer identifies her with the goddess Enyo, which means havoc. And he says, Eris, whose wrath is relentless, she's the sister and companion of murderous Ares. She who's only a little thing at first, but thereafter grows until she strides along the earth with her head striking heaven. She then hurled down bitterness equally between both sides, as she walked through the onslaught, making men's pain heavier. So again, I'm tempted to see the image of strife kind of literally growing in terms of Freudian repression. From being ignored and repressed, she expands to a kind of vast size. Or perhaps it kept tamped down in the unconscious, she expands to become the proverbial elephant in the living room. So, just to give you a kind of personal example of this, when I was in my kind of early 20s, I was a private tutor for a kind of teenage girl. And she was a Libra, at least I suspect she might have been. And so I think she probably had a Sun Eris position at work in her chart. And she was given to self-harming. And her mother was a seductive and rather glacial personality who was clearly kind of jagged with rage at her daughter's refusal to kind of get up and wash, and her habit of cutting her arms with razor blades all the time. So I recall very distinctly being sat down in their kitchen to teach 12th night to the daughter, as the mother was kind of busying around us making small talk, and totally ignoring the fact that the girl was sitting there with blood running down her arms. And it was absolutely clear that the mother thought I had to react as though this was totally normal, rather than it was very, very strange. So I was treated very, very clearly as though I wasn't there, as I was, as it were, a person of no importance, and that this was to be ignored. And both went on very strongly to try and get me onto their side. It was a very interesting dynamic. And the atmosphere of kind of unspoken rage and conflict was so powerful and so uncomfortable for me as an outsider that eventually I just resigned. I couldn't tolerate it anymore. So Mars Eris, therefore, may suggest both healthy self-assertion through competition, Eris is emulation again, as well as difficult, kind of knotty conflict and violence. Jupiter and Eris are strongly linked in myth. Hesiod, as we've seen, has Zeus, a Jupiter, implanting the positive Eris in Earth's roots. Now, that's a very weird phrase, suggesting that she's firmly embedded in our experience of being incarnate, of living on Earth in our physical bodies. So it also suggests that she needs proper acknowledgement if we're to live well and acknowledge and enjoy the Earth's produce. So she represents, as it were, a kind of Saturnian gumption here, the urge towards profitable industry, a kind of positive version of God's curse upon Adam in the book of Genesis. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. Interestingly, in kind of other bits of Greek literature, it appears that it's Zeus himself who is responsible for getting Eris to disrupt the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, along with the goddess Themis, the personification of that which is right, that peculiarly Greek combination of natural and social law. So Zeus felt, according to this myth, that the world was becoming gravely overpopulated, and that what was needed was a good drawn-out war to thin the population out as a method of culling human beings. So therefore, before the wedding, he stationed Hermes at the door and told him to forbid Eris entrance. And when he did so, Eris rolled the clearly pre-prepared apple into the assembly from the door, thus bringing about the war, as Zeus knew she would. So my own feeling here is that it's not Zeus-Jupiter, but Themis who's the key here. That Zeus is just something of a kind of patriarchal stooge. Themis is a very Plutonian deity, the mother of the fates. She represents the boundaries of natural law, which bring nemesis crashing down on you if you cross them. So Eris is here, I think, the kind of executive branch of Nemesis. That's one way to describe her. Eris, in this guise, doesn't destroy by attacking personally, laying about her with weapons like her brother Ares. Rather, with one small, well-placed action, she exposes radical internal conflict. She lays bare internal dissension, which ensures that people destroy themselves. It's a very interesting difference in the way of attacking. Saturn, as we've seen, the positive Eris is potentially rather compatible with Saturnian values. One might expect tenacity and industriousness to be appropriate interpretations of an Eris, Saturn Eris trine or a sextile, or a conjunction between the two planets, trining the Sun and Moon. So negative Eris also chimes in with Saturn's tendency to resentment and a sense of exclusion. Eris might well be implicated in Saturnian situations of victimization, chronic insecurity, with their unfortunate associations of scapegoating as well. So Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma bomber, had Eris conjunct both Chiron on one side and Saturn and Venus on the other. Perhaps we might think symbolically in terms of Eris's apple, in terms of explosive devices. That might be something which we could think about. But on the other hand, Saturn represents the boundaries of the personality, its barriers and defences, and whilst Eris might represent the breaching of those barriers by repressed material. Uranus and Eris have some kind of kinship. They're both disruptive to the old order. Uranus does away with the old from the top down, though, if you like, by imposing a new order or pattern, whereas Eris, on the other hand, has links to the squalling Freudian id, destroying the old from the bottom up by, as it were, forcibly reminding it of what's been hidden down in the basement. So that quotation I gave you from Jean Rhys at the beginning about the hammer being drawn out and smashing the skull like an egg is kind of Saturn Eris. In total contrast to Uranus, Eris has no interest in building or imposing something new. Eris doesn't have a plan. Eris represents a realm of archaic instinctuality with which Uranus would rather not deal at all, although the two planets might have superficially similar aims. I can't see any common ground between Eris and Neptune. Eris is all about a sense of difference, not Neptunian porousness. They might conceivably share a sense of exclusion and resentment and abandonment, but where Neptune suffers and self-victimizes, Eris plots revenge. So they're very, very distinct. Pluto and Chiron are the planets most obviously akin to Eris. Pluto and Eris, as I've noticed, represent, I think, very primal impersonal urges to struggle and survive. And I'm rather glad I'm not going to be around to see the Pluto-Eris conjunction in about 100 years' time. If I had to place a small bet on some kind of ghastly climate change-driven Third World War, then I think that might be some time to a good time. Chiron shares a kind of maverick quality with Eris, and Eris, like Chiron, is possessed of a vast and savage rage. But with Chiron, the rage is inspired by a wound which is nobody's fault, a wound but for which there is nevertheless no cure. It's a planet which seems to have a connection with a sense of cosmic unfairness, as we know. With Eris, on the other hand, the rage is personal. It's a sense of pique, of anger at being excluded from the party. As I noted above, there's something in Eris which is about a sense of injured merit, something satanic, in fact, in the kind of Miltonic sense, which reminds me very strongly of kind of the murky patterns of Othello. So Eris Pluto, Eris Chiron might well have an Iago quality. And I think I was going to say something about Othello, but in fact I will. So this is all I was saying on the subject of Eris. So thank you very much for all of you for wading through this series of descriptions. I hope there's plenty of material still to look at, and this is eventually going to emerge as a large book. But I would be very interested if you do any work on Eris yourselves to hear about any discoveries you have or any experiences you've had about working with Eris and charts. So thank you very much indeed.